Imagine this. In the fall of 1854, deep in Louisiana's river country, a black slave girl touched a white doctor's hand, and in the next breath began to speak of his childhood, of a broken watch he'd hidden in a barn decades ago, terrified of his father's wrath. The air that afternoon at Seven Oaks Plantation hung thick and wet, heavy with sugarcane smoke and the scent of mud from the bayou. Cicadas pulsed like a fever in the trees. Thomas Beauregard, master of the estate, stood by the veranda rail, polishing a silver cane head while waiting for the doctor from New Orleans. Behind him, the fields shimmered gold and green, a beauty masking rot. Dr. Charles Whitfield arrived on horseback, coat dusty from the river road. He was young for his profession, yet already carried himself like a man who knew more than others. He'd been summoned, he was told, to examine a peculiar Negro child. Inside the main house, the air was dim and close. The girl sat at a small table, thin, barefoot, silent. Her name, the overseer said, was Lila, 8 years old, too quiet, too watchful. Her eyes stayed on people longer than any child's should. Whitfield lifted her wrist to check the pulse. Her skin was cool, the bones bird-light. Then, without warning, her body stiffened. The child's voice, low, deliberate, began to speak. "You broke it," she said. "You hid it in the straw. Your daddy's watch." The doctor froze. Beauregard laughed at first, a short, uneasy bark. "Well, that's a trick, ain't it?" But Lila kept speaking, about a boy named Charles, 10 years old, about the smell of hay and the sound of boots coming down the barn steps, about guilt that had never been confessed. Whitfield's face drained. He jerked his hand away and wiped it hard with his handkerchief, as if to scrape off something unholy. Beauregard leaned forward, forcing a grin. "Who told you that, girl?" Lila turned her gaze on him. "You sold him," she murmured. "You saw his wife cry, and you dreamed of it still." Beauregard's smile broke. For a heartbeat, the room went silent except for the drone of insects outside. One of the white men in the doorway whispered, "How's she know that?" The girl's eyes were open but far away, her voice thin as smoke. "I just see what's left behind." The doctor backed toward the door. "This is no medical matter," he muttered. "Keep her from touching anyone." That night, the house servants said they heard him pacing in his room until dawn, pen scratching, then stopping. In his journal, found years later in a wooden cigar box, there is one brief entry, written in a careful, nervous hand. Case 7. Colored girl, impossible anamnesis. No diagnosis, no conclusion. Only that phrase. Beauregard, meanwhile, kept his lamps burning late. He'd mocked the girl at first. By midnight, he was drinking alone. The image she had spoken of, his first slave sale. The boy's screaming wife came back sharper than any dream. He did not sleep. By morning, Dr. Whitfield saddled his horse and rode toward New Orleans. He drafted a letter to the medical society describing a case that defies natural reason, then folded it away, unsent. Fear tightened around him like the Louisiana heat, fear of ridicule, of curiosity, of whatever sin the child had seen in him. 2 weeks later, 3 white men who had been present at that examination were dead or gone from the parish. One drowned near the ferry crossing, one shot himself. The third vanished along the river road. None of their obituaries mentioned the plantation, nor the girl named Lila. But in Whitfield's private papers, a line remained. Memory is contagious. And that was only the beginning of what she would make others remember. Take a breath. Picture that autumn night at Seven Oaks, still hanging in the air, the sound of insects outside, the heavy sweetness of cane, and that small, trembling hand that made a doctor lose faith in what he knew about the world. Now, before we go deeper, I'll ask you something simple. Tell me where you're listening from. Your town, your state. It's strange comfort, knowing how many of us are gathered around one story, spread across the country that once tried to bury it. If you believe such buried voices deserve to be heard, you can stay with us. Subscribe, share, whatever it takes to keep memory breathing. Because this story isn't just about a little black girl who saw things she wasn't meant to see. It's about what happens when the past refuses to stay buried, when memory itself becomes dangerous. You see, in a world built on forgetting, a slave was supposed to have no history, no past, no lineage, no voice strong enough to remember what white men wanted erased. But Lila's gift, or curse, shattered that order. She didn't just remember her own people's pain. She looked into white faces and spoke their hidden shame back to them. That was the sin no law could name and no preacher could cleanse. To the planters and doctors of Louisiana, knowledge was supposed to move one way, down from the white mind to the black body. Lila reversed that current. Her silence held more power than their sermons. Her sight cut through skin, through status, straight to what they feared most, the proof that their own souls were not clean. We know about her not because the powerful told us, but because fragments survived in places they never looked. A few lines in a privately bound journal from a New Orleans physician. A trembling note in the records of St. Mark's Episcopal Church, calling her disturbing. A county ledger listing only female child, mulatto, property of T. Beauregard. And, decades later, in the voices of the old, those WPA interviews gathered by the Federal Writers Project, where former slaves still whispered her name like a wound that wouldn't heal. Half those records are gone. Others were sealed in family boxes, marked confidential. But the pattern remains clear enough. Every witness tried to explain her away, as illness, devilry, hysteria. Anything except what she was. A mirror. Think of it this way. What's more dangerous to a slaveholder? A man with a weapon, or a child who knows what you did 15 years ago, in the dark, when no one was supposed to see? One of the doctors who examined her wrote of a proposal from a colleague at Charity Hospital in New Orleans, an invitation to study her under controlled conditions. That letter was never sent, but a draft remains, folded between pages stained with ash. Another document, unsigned, reports a Subject L, described only as possessing an impossible memory. And then, silence. By the time the Civil War began, the name Lila disappeared from all official records. Yet she reappeared somewhere no one expected, in a confessional diary, kept by a white woman who could never quite forget the child's eyes. So, before we chase her into those earlier years, ask yourself, what frightened them more? Her visions, or the possibility that truth could belong to someone like her? To understand why physicians refused to speak of her in public, why even men of science trembled at a child's touch, we have to go back 8 years, to the night she was born. A sweltering summer in 1846, a single candle burning beside a sweating midwife who whispered that maybe this baby should not draw breath at all. And when that same woman reached 90 and gave her testimony to the WPA, she ended her story with words no one could twist into reason. I tried to send that baby back to the Lord, but the Lord sent her back to us. After that, she said nothing more. The night she was born pressed down like a fever. The air in the slave quarters was thick with the smell of sweat, iron, and candle smoke. Outside, the cane rustled in the heat, frogs rasped in the ditches, and somewhere, a whippoorwill called, as if it knew what had just come into the world. Rose's cries had faded to hoarse gasps. Aunt May's hands, dark and steady as the earth, moved with practiced precision. She had caught hundreds of babies, but never felt a weight like this one. Not on her arms, but on her spirit. The child slid into her palms, small and silent, her skin slick and still, her eyes shut tight. No cry. No breath. "She gone?" one of the women whispered. Aunt May didn't answer. She turned the baby over, tapped her back, rubbed her chest, whispered a prayer half in scripture, half in something older. The child stayed limp. Then, just as May was about to draw the cloth over her, the baby opened her eyes, wide, too wide, and looked straight at her. Wasn't the blind stare of a newborn. It was knowing. Heavy. As if she were seeing May from far away, from behind her own life. The midwife froze. Her mouth went dry. Then, in the faintest rasp of a voice, the infant spoke. The others swore. Later it couldn't be words, just a hiss of air. But May knew what she heard. "You left your boy by the river. He wasn't sleeping. He was gone." May's hands trembled. That secret. The baby she lost years ago, the one she buried alone by the riverbank. She had never spoken of it, not even in prayer. For one burning second, she pressed the infant to her chest, meaning to smother the breath that had just begun. "Better you go back," she thought, "than bring the curse that's walking with you." But then Rose's cracked whisper came from the bed. "Don't. Please." Just one word, and May's grip broke. The baby took a small, ragged breath. Not a cry, but a low, weighty sound, as though she already carried too much of the world inside her lungs. The women around the room crossed themselves, some muttering, some spitting to ward off spirits. One said it was the mark of the ancestors. Another called it the devil's trick. May only wrapped the child tight and whispered, "Lord, help us all." They named her Lila. In the years that followed, her silence was louder than other children's laughter. She stared too long at people, as if waiting for something to rise out of them. At 3, she began repeating words no one remembered saying, phrases from long ago, spoken in voices not her own. One afternoon, she touched the arm of a young woman who had been sold from her family as a girl. Lila looked into her eyes and said softly, "Your mama name was Clara. She sang 'Steal Away' when the man came to take you." The woman fell to her knees, weeping, and from that day on, avoided Lila's gaze. By 4, Aunt May stopped sitting near her at the fire. The child made her bones ache, stirred memories she had buried deep. Yet she still left food for her, still whispered blessings when no one watched. The Whites hardly noticed the girl until the new overseer came. Collins was young, proud, mean for sport. One morning, when he struck an old field hand with his whip, Lila stood nearby, staring. The man turned to glare at her, and she said, in a voice rougher, older than her own, "He beat you like that too, didn't he? Your daddy, out back, said it'd make you strong." Collins went pale. For a breath, he looked like a boy again, caught and cornered. Then he shouted, "Get her away from me," and struck the post instead of her. After that day, he made sure she never came near the fields when he was there. But the stories spread. Some said she could hear sin itself. Some said she was the echo of every pain that had ever touched the soil. And in the big house, little Emily Beauregard, the planter's daughter, began sneaking out to play with her. One bright afternoon, they sat under the cypress tree, sharing crumbs of sugar. Emily giggled, held out her hand. Lila touched it gently, eyes glassy and still. "Your mama cried last night," she said. "She asked the Lord not to let the baby come. Said it wasn't your papa's." The laughter stopped. In the doorway of the house, Mrs. Beauregard froze, her face turning to stone. Emily stared. confused, while the air thickened into silence. That was the moment they all began to see what Aunt May had known since that summer night. This child wasn't meant to forget, and she would make the rest of them remember. Mrs. Beauregard stood in the doorway that afternoon like someone turned to salt, her hand still on the frame, listening to her own forbidden prayer spill from a slave child's mouth. But that moment under the cypress was not the first time Lila had let loose what ought to have stayed buried, and it would not be the last. By then, the quarters were already full of stories about her touch. Take old Elias. Folks said he was strong as any stump in the swamp, the kind of man who outlived bad seasons and hard overseers. One evening he sat by the fire in the quarters, laughing, pipe in hand. Lila slipped in quiet, as she always did, and settled beside him. Her small fingers brushed his shoulder. She frowned, as if listening to something inside his bones. "Your chest burnin'," she murmured. "Fire inside, not out." He chuckled, waved her off. "I feel fine, girl." 3 days later, he dropped in the field, hand pressed to his heart, eyes searching the sky for someone none of them could see. When they carried him back, stiff and still, half the quarters whispered that Lila had tried to warn him. The other half muttered that she had brought it on. Then came Sadie. Just a little thing, ribs like sticks, taken by fever in the hottest part of summer. She tossed on her pallet, breath rattling, skin so hot the air above her seemed to shimmer. Aunt May did all she knew. Teas, poultices, prayers, and still the girl slipped away by inches. Lila was told to stay back. She crept in anyway, kneeling at Sadie's side. She took the burning hand in both of hers and began to whisper. Some of the words were plain scripture. Others rolled out in a cadence older than the Bible, a tongue the elders halfway recognized and halfway feared. By dawn, Sadie's sweat had cooled, her eyes focused. She asked for water. "Lord done touched her," one woman declared. Another shook her head. "That ain't just the Lord. That's something else right in that child." So they drew lines. A few of the elders slipped Lila extra bread or a scrap of bright cloth, calling her marked by the old ones. Jacob the blacksmith watched over her when he could, teaching her in a low voice. "Don't lay hands on white folks lessen you must. They don't take kindly to us, knowin' what we ain't supposed to know." Others crossed the yard to avoid her, fingers tied around little bundles of dried roots, when she walked past. Children were warned not to let her stare linger on them. At night, near the fires, arguments broke out in whispers. Was she protection or trouble that would bring the lash on them all? Aunt May, who had almost stopped that first breath, kept her distance and her duty both. "Girl," she told Lila once, not unkindly, "white folks don't like questions they ain't asked. You look at 'em like you got answers." Still, people came to her. One night Hannah, a young woman with eyes always searching the road, pulled Lila behind the smokehouse. Samuel, the man she loved, was to be sent downriver within the week. "Touch him," Hannah begged, voice shaking. "Tell me if I ever see him again." Samuel stood there, jaw set, trying to act braver than he felt. Lila placed her hand on his wrist. The pictures rose up in her mind so fast, she almost staggered. Iron on his ankles, in a yard she didn't know, a muddy road, the crack of a rifle in the dark. She saw him running once, twice, and what happened the third time? "Don't go that night," she said, eyes wide. "The night it's stormin'. You run then, you don't come back." Samuel pulled his arm away. "I ain't lettin' no little girl tell me when I can chase my freedom." He ran on a storm night anyway. They caught him before dawn. The punishment was public and meant to instruct. Lila watched from the edge of the crowd, nails biting her palms, each blow echoing the image she had already seen. Some of the people glanced at her, not at Samuel. She knew, someone hissed later in the dark, and still it happened. That was the cruelest part of her gift. She could see, sometimes warn, but she could not turn the river of events. The knowledge sat in her like a stone. Afterward, Overseer Collins studied her differently. While Samuel cried out, Lila's gaze wasn't on the raw stripes, but somewhere beyond Collins, as if there was another scene layered behind his shoulders. It unsettled him more than the groans at his feet. "That girl ain't right," he muttered to Thomas Beauregard later on the gallery. "She look at a man like she's readin' him line by line." Thomas sipped his drink, eyes on the fields. "Then perhaps," he said slowly, "we should let someone trained in such matters take a look." He meant the city. He meant New Orleans, and men with books and instruments who thought they could name every kind of mind. On 7 Oaks, the cane kept growing, the river kept sliding past, and somewhere in a desk drawer Thomas rarely opened lay the first rough note about a doctor in town who might find use for an unusual child. By the time Collins muttered that a proper man from New Orleans ought to look at the girl, the Beauregard house was already colder toward Lila than the river fog. After the day under the cypress, Mrs. Beauregard stopped letting Emily anywhere near the quarters. Doors that had once swung open for errands snapped shut. If Lila came up to the back gallery with a tray, another child was sent instead. Weeks later, in a small leather notebook she kept hidden beneath her linen, the mistress would write a single tight line about the little colored girl who looked at me as though heaven itself had sent her to weigh my soul. The story spread beyond the plantation faster than cane fire. On a Sunday in St. Mark's Episcopal Church, someone whispered to the visiting clergyman about a Negro child that talks like she'd been standing in your shadow all your life. The Reverend agreed to call. Curiosity and fear travel well together. He arrived in a stiff collar, Bible tucked under his arm, determined to classify what he saw. Sin, madness, trickery. In the front room of 7 Oaks, with the shutters half closed against the heat, he had Lila brought in. "Come here, child," he said, extending his hand, as one might offer it to a stray dog. "We are told you see things." She put her palm in his, her eyes clouded, not like someone falling asleep, but like someone watching a distant scene. When she spoke, her voice was low and oddly formal. "You was young. Nighttime. You said the words with your mouth, but not your heart. You took the money and told the woman to go. You ain't look back." The Reverend's face emptied of color. There had been such a night, years before his ordination, with a woman he had paid to disappear. No one in St. Charles Parish knew that story. He snatched his hand away as if burned. "This is not of God," he said hoarsely. "This is deception. Or worse." To Thomas, he advised distance and discipline. Separate her from the others. Do not encourage these displays. In the church register, the only trace of his visit would be a brief, careful phrase. Called at local estate. Observed troubling manifestations among Negro child. Counseled stricter oversight. No names. No details. That evening at the dining table, with the flies humming and the silverware soft against china, the white adult spoke in tones just above a whisper. Collins drank heavily, jaw tight. "Sir, this ain't right. Sell her south. Let some traitor downriver be troubled with her tales." Thomas stared at his plate, calculating risk and reputation. "A story like this, if mishandled, makes a man look ridiculous," he said. "I will not have my name become a joke in New Orleans." Mrs. Beauregard, pale but steady, surprised them both. "We cannot simply send her away," she said. We must understand what she is." That sentence hung between them like smoke. Within days, Thomas drafted a letter to an acquaintance in New Orleans who had ties to Charity Hospital and the city's medical society. The draft, later found among his scattered papers, described a young female slave who speaks of events she could not possibly have witnessed, as though memory were a contagion picked up from those she touches. The man he was referred to was Dr. Charles Whitfield. Younger than most of the city physicians, Whitfield had studied under men who weighed skulls and lectured about racial capacity. He believed the black brain a lesser instrument, suited for labor, not thought. A case like this, he assumed on the carriage ride upriver, would be easily explained. Ignorance, suggestion, perhaps some form of nervous disorder. When he arrived at Seven Oaks, he carried a small leather case and a notebook already ruled into neat sections. Lila was brought into a side room, seated on a straight-backed chair. He observed her with professional detachment. Slight frame, clear eyes, no obvious deformity. He checked her pulse, counted her breaths, looked into her pupils with a practiced squint. "Does she sleepwalk? Seize? Speak in her rest?" he asked Aunt May and Rose, not waiting for full answers. Only then did he say, "Place your hand here on the table." Her thin arm extended. He rested his fingers against her wrist, intending to time her pulse. At the first contact, her gaze drifted past his shoulder, fixed on something only she could see. "You hid the broken watch," she murmured, "in the hay. 'Fore your daddy found it. You thought he'd whip you. He whipped the boy, said he ain't touch it." Whitfield's hand jerked. That childhood scene, the shattered pocket watch, the wrong boy punished in his place, belonged to a barn hundreds of miles away and more than 20 years behind him. No one in Louisiana knew it. He withdrew, then forced himself back to the task, masking the tremor as irritation. Method, he told himself. Procedure. He had Thomas send in others, one by one, a housemaid, a field hand, Collins himself. He changed the order, gave no names, kept his questions neutral. Each time, when her skin met theirs, Lila spoke of some buried incident with unnerving specificity. A hidden theft, an abandoned child, a promise broken behind a church. In his notebook, his careful hand grew uneven. Subject exhibits accurate recitation of biographical events, of which she should have no knowledge. No prompting. Phenomenon cannot be accounted for by simple deceit. Consider term anamnesis, but beyond known scope. That night in the small room set aside for guests, Whitfield sat with the notebook open and a blank sheet before him. He began a letter to a colleague at Charity Hospital. "I have encountered on a plantation upriver a colored girl, approx. 8 years, whose apparent access to others' reminiscences raises grave questions for our understanding of memory." He paused, pen hovering. What would the society make of such a report? What questions would they ask about his own conduct, his presence on a slave estate, his reliance on planters' patronage? And beneath those considerations pulsed something simpler, more primitive. The sensation of that small hand under his fingers, and the sound of his own childhood shame coming back to him in her thin voice. The word he had written, memory, suddenly felt less like a faculty, and more like a door he did not want anyone to prove could be opened. Slowly, he folded the half-written letter, tore it twice, and fed the pieces to the lamp flame until they curled into black curls of ash. The notebook he kept, closing it on a final line where one word was underlined again and again. Amnesis. Impossible. His silence that night would not save the girl. It would only delay the moment when fear of what she knew would break over her like a storm. After the doctor's visit, the story of what Lila had said moved through the house like a draft you couldn't see but felt in your bones. No one spoke of it outright, yet doors closed a little faster. Glances tightened when she passed. She was no longer sent to carry water into the dining room. Emily's lessons on the gallery went on without her. If she wandered too near the back steps, a house servant would hiss softly, "Go on now, girl," and steer her away, as if she were tracking mud across fine carpet. Collins made his own adjustment. "Keep that one out my fields when I'm working," he told the driver. "I don't want her eyes on my back." From then on, when he rode out with his whip and ledger, Lila was kept to odd jobs, away from his line of sight. To an 8-year-old, it felt less like policy and more like banishment. She had not chosen what she saw when she touched people, and now the whole place seemed to declare that she herself was the offense. So she started folding her hands under her arms, shying from contact, as if she could lock the visions in her skin. It didn't work. The lives of others still pressed against her, unsummoned. The turning point came on a bright afternoon when Thomas's younger sister arrived from town. Mrs. Caroline Marsh stepped down from the carriage in pale silk, all perfume and laughter, unaware of the unease that had settled over the estate. Spotting Lila near the kitchen yard, she smiled the way some white ladies did at small animals. "Aren't you a pretty little thing?" she cooed, fishing a wrapped sweet from her reticule. "Come here, child." No one reached her in time. Lila approached, wary but hungry for a kind voice. Caroline laid a gloved hand lightly on her shoulder as she offered the sugar. The contact was enough. Lila's gaze drifted, sharpening on something only she could see. "Stairs," she whispered. "You push her. She fall. Neck bend wrong. You don't scream. You just watch." The color drained from Caroline's face. Years earlier, in her father's house, there had been a tumble on the staircase, a black girl's body twisted at the bottom, the quick decision to call it an accident and move on. Caroline had never confessed her part, even to God. Now, on the noisy gallery, she let out a ragged sound that made the whole yard fall still. "Get that creature away from me!" she shrieked, stumbling backward. "Thomas! She's bewitched! She's evil! She knows things!" For a planter, fear easily becomes anger. Thomas could not explain to his sister that he had invited a physician who had left more shaken than he arrived. He could, however, show that he was master in his own house. By dusk, Lila's pallet was moved from the women's quarters to a narrow, airless shed where tools and broken harnesses were kept. Children were warned that if they went near her, they'd taste the lash. To the ledger, she became another line. Girl, small, unfit for house. Nights in the shed were damp and close, the smell of oil and rust thick in her throat. Through the slats, she could hear distant voices, the thump of someone punished, the mutter of prayer. Images she had no room for crowded her mind, other people's secrets with nowhere to go. Aunt May came once, standing in the doorway with a lamp, her face carved by shadow. "You hush that sight best you can," she murmured. "Truth ain't safe in this place. Not that kind." Later, Jacob risked more. When the yard was quiet, he slipped to the shed with a heel of bread and a gourd of water. He crouched low so their voices wouldn't carry. "You gotta stop speaking what you see to white folks," he told her, eyes wet with frustration. "They don't want your knowing. They want obedience. You hear me? The truth you carry, it can kill us quicker than any rope." "I don't try," she whispered. "It just comes." He brushed her hair back with work-rough fingers. "Then you hold it inside, for your own sake, for ours. Sometimes living means letting a lie sit on top of what's real." The next night, Collins caught Jacob slipping away from the shed. In his mind, a slave near a locked door meant only two things: plotting or escape. By morning, Jacob was tied to a post, stripped to the waist before gathered eyes. Lila watched through the crack in the boards as the whip rose and fell, each strike echoing against the memory of her own warning ignored. Something in her snapped. As Collins stepped back to admire the suffering he'd arranged, she pushed the door open and stumbled toward him, bare feet in the dust. Before anyone could stop her, her hand brushed his wrist. Words tore out of her. "He sold you. Your own daddy. Sent you off with strangers, 'cause he ain't want your shame in his house." Collins recoiled as if struck. The old wound, being sent away as a boy, the quiet disgust in his father's eyes, flared hot. Humiliation washed his face, then hardened into rage. "She's cursed," he spat. "She's dangerous. Sell her down river, or give her to them city men who cut into brains. I don't care which, so long as she's gone." Behind her, composed mask, Mrs. Beauregard's fingers trembled around her handkerchief. "If we turn her over to those places," she said quietly to her husband later, "what does that say of us to God? Perhaps she is a scourge, but perhaps she is a warning. And we have had enough warnings." For the first time, her fear worked in Lila's favor. The talk of sale and hospitals cooled to sullen delay. The girl remained in her wooden cell, neither freed nor disposed of, simply contained, as if distance alone could muffle whatever moved through her. One of those nights, while the frogs called and Jacob groaned in his sleep, Lila sat awake on her pallet, eyes open to the dark. She saw fires where there were none, uniforms and colors she did not know, flags she had never been taught. She saw men in gray and blue falling into the same dust where she sat. Papers stamped, freed, that did not loosen chains inside people's heads. "They all gonna burn," she whispered, more to the shadows than to herself. "They gonna pay. But we gonna bleed first." In another bed, in another shack, a woman who couldn't sleep heard the child's voice drifting through the boards. Decades later, when a WPA worker asked if she'd ever known anyone strange, that sentence was the only thing she could still repeat word for word. By the time Lila was 9, the shed walls no longer kept other people's lives out. They seeped through her skin the way damp crept up the boards. That first night of fire and uniforms that did not yet exist had left a mark. She didn't have words like war or union, but her body knew something was coming that would swallow fields and fences alike. Days slid into years. When she touched someone now, it wasn't only pictures that rose. Sometimes her own limbs answered. A hand that had never held a musket would jerk as if from recoil. A girl's narrow shoulders suddenly stooped under the memory of a man's old back injury. Once, after brushing against a woman who had broken her ankle long ago, Lila limped for hours, though there was nothing wrong with her bones. Her voice shifted too. Jacob heard it first. Lila took his hand one evening, intending only comfort, and a rush of scenes flooded her. Iron glowing in the forge, a boy in chains on a dock. When she spoke, the words came out in a cadence not her own, deeper, older. Jacob flinched, as if his dead father had spoken through her. Aunt May, frightened but unwilling to abandon the child, tried what little she knew to ease the weight. She burned dried leaves in a broken clay dish, bathed Lila's forehead with water steeped in roots, and muttered prayers stitched from psalms and the fragments of African phrases carried across the ocean in her memory. "Let what ain't hers pass through," she murmured, fanning the smoke over the girl. "Don't let it settle." Still, people came. Quietly, when Collins was away or the house slept, they slipped to the shed and asked the questions no preacher could answer. "Can you see my babies?" a woman whispered, hands twisting in her apron. "They took 'em when I was young. I don't even know if they got another name." Lila touched her, and the images rose. A muddy auction yard, A girl screaming as two boys were led away, the stamp of a bill of sale. Faces, then distance, then nothing. "I see 'em cryin'," Lila said, chest tight. "Then I don't see no more. They carried far, past what I can reach." The woman sobbed anyway. Even that small confirmation, that her children had existed beyond her grief, was a kind of cruel mercy. Another man, darker-skinned and careful with his words, leaned close one night. "I was snatched in the north," he said. "Folks say I was always a slave, but my bones don't agree. Tell me if I was free before." Her fingers closed around his. She saw snow, a small wooden house with no overseer in sight, a paper with his name on it that was never shown to the men who dragged him south. "You knew your own time once," she said softly. "They took it like they took you." He nodded, jaw clenched, eyes shining in the dim light. Sometimes the truth hurt more than ignorance. But they kept coming, because not knowing had its own sharp edge. It wasn't only the enslaved who brushed against her now. One autumn, a neighboring planter, Mr. Harlan, rode over to speak with Thomas about debts and crops. Business brought him, but gossip kept him an extra hour. At some point, he handed his hat to Lila without looking, as if she were another piece of furniture. Her fingers grazed the brim, then the rough wool of his coat. Smoke. Mud. Men shouting over the thunder of guns. She saw him sprawled on a field he had never seen, a hole torn in his chest, a strip of blue cloth pressed under his hand. Not the faded work shirt she knew, something else, part of a uniform that did not yet exist. "You don't come back here," she blurted, startling herself. "I see you laying down with blue all around. Smoke so thick you can't see home." Harlan jerked his coat away, cursing. Thomas scolded her, embarrassed in front of his guest. Years later, when news came that Harlan had fallen in an early battle wearing gray, not blue, some remembered the girl's words and wondered if she had seen the color of the flag over him, not the cloth on his back. Far downriver, Dr. Whitfield could not forget her either. He kept a section in his notebook, marked only with an initial. Every few months, he added an observation stolen from rumor. Other plantations reporting odd Negroes, sudden collapses after fits of recollection. At last, he composed a cautious letter to a colleague at Charity Hospital, describing a patient with unusual memory phenomena, without mentioning race or bondage. The reply, written in a neat, distant hand, advised him to leave such matters alone. Cases tied to superstition among the enslaved were politically delicate. To investigate too publicly would invite questions about discipline, morality, and the very structure on which their society rested. Lila paid the price for everybody's fear in her own flesh. Headaches split her skull. Sometimes blood trickled from her nose after a day of too many hands, too many stories. She began losing pieces of her own small life. She would forget whether she had eaten, whether she'd spoken to someone that morning, while remembering with perfect clarity the shape of a scar on a stranger's back 20 years before. A doctor, long after the war, looking at Whitfield's surviving notes, would scribble in the margin, "If such a child truly bore fragments of many lives, it is not surprising that her own sense of self frayed." In the quarters, explanations took other forms. Some elders said Lila was a road that had never closed between this world and the land of those gone on. Others said she was walking proof that history did not belong to white folks alone. Aunt May summed it up one evening, staring into the fire. "They built, they power on tellin' the story they way. That girl show story don't listen to who owned the land." One night, as cicadas screamed in the trees and the river rolled black beyond the cane, Lila woke on her pallet, heart pounding. She could recite, without effort, the names of a dozen people whose hands she'd held. She remembered their mothers, their lost children, their first beatings. Her own first memory would not come. She shook Aunt May's shoulder in the dark. "What's my name?" she asked, voice raw. "Am I me?" The old woman answered her, but years later, she could not recall what she said. Only the question remained, hanging in the space between them, a crack in the surface. From that crack, the next great rupture in Lila's life would open, the one no one would be able to laugh off as superstition or hide in a note marked confidential. The trouble started, as it often did on Seven Oaks, with something small that belonged to a white woman. A brooch went missing from Mrs. Beauregard's dressing table, then a pair of earrings. Drawers were checked, servants questioned. It did not take Overseer Collins long to decide which direction suspicion ought to travel. Isaac, a young man quick on his feet and quicker in his thoughts, had spoken out of turn once too often. Collins seized on him like a dog on a scent. "We got ourselves a thief," he announced in the yard, "and we got ourselves a tool to find him." His eyes slid toward the shed where Lila slept. They dragged her out into the sunlight, blinking, thin arms wrapped around herself. Collins forced Isaac to stand before her. "Put your hand on him," he ordered. "Tell Master what you see." She didn't reach for the young man first. Her fingers brushed his sleeve, and images jumped. A heel of bread sneaked from the kitchen, a few potatoes hidden under a shirt, all for his younger sister's belly. Nothing glittered. No gold. No pearls. Hunger. Not greed. She lifted her gaze to Collins instead. His hand, gripping her shoulder, trembled just enough to betray him. The moment her skin met his, she saw barrels in the storage room, lids pried up at night, scoops of sugar gone missing and marked down as rats. "He taken what ain't his," she said quietly. "Not him." She nodded toward Isaac. "You." The yard went still. For a heartbeat, every enslaved person within earshot watched the overseer, not the accused man. Collins's face darkened to the color of old blood. "Lies," he barked. He struck her hard enough to send her sprawling. Devil-tongued girl. The jewels were eventually found, beneath Isaac's pallet, as if they had walked there on their own. The whipping went ahead as planned. But the moment when Lila named Collins, that could not be unseen, even by those who pretended not to hear it. Word of a black child who spoke white men's secrets reached beyond the parish. In a small office lined with ledgers, the county clerk mentioned her to Judge Pritchard, a man whose job was to keep order more than justice. A girl like that, if believed even a little, could bend the usual lines of power in dangerous directions. Pritchard rode out himself. He questioned Thomas on the gallery, voice mild, eyes sharp. "Any signs of madness among your people? Fits? Disturbances?" When he saw Lila, he took in her size, her bare feet, the mark on her cheek where Collins's hand had landed. "Cases like this," he remarked, almost to himself, "can be recorded as mental deficiency. There are institutions that receive such persons." In his private notes later, he would write, "Possible example of Negro hysteria or mimicry, advisable to classify as unsound if situation escalates." No name, no hint that the case was a child. Mrs. Beauregard, still haunted by her own exposed prayer, asked for a priest from New Orleans. Not the country reverend this time, but Father O'Reilly, educated, weary, accustomed to hearing confessions behind carved screens. He came with crucifix and stole, smelling of tobacco and old incense. They led Lila into the parlor as if to a small trial. He questioned her, sprinkled water, read Latin phrases meant to cleanse or condemn. "Repeat after me," he said firmly, reciting a line from an old seminary lesson about trusting God above human reason. She echoed him once, twice. Then, to his horror, she shifted from repetition to perfect recall. In clear Latin, with his own youthful cadence, she repeated a blasphemous joke he had whispered years ago to a fellow student, testing the limits of his faith. His hands shook. No bishop, no parishioner, no one on this soil knew that moment. He broke off the rite. Keeping her here is perilous, he told the Beauregards afterward. If you cannot silence this gift, you should consider removing her to a place where her influence is contained, for the sake of Christian order. In the quarters, her existence tore the community in two. Some, like Jacob and Aunt May, whispered about hiding her, even sending her north if a chance ever came. Others glared in her direction and said, "If she bring the white law down on us, we all gonna suffer for what she see." A small circle formed around her at night. Jacob, May, one or two others. They practiced with her the hardest lesson of survival. "When you feel it comin'," Jacob said, "you bite your tongue. You keep your eyes on the ground. If they ask what you see, you say, 'Nothing, sir.' You learn to lie so you can live." She tried, but truth in her did not move like something she chose. It rose like fever. On paper, the white men tried their own kind of control. In the files of the Louisiana Medical Society, there would later be a draft abstract, never delivered, about anomalous memory phenomena in a colored subject, returned to its author with a margin note. Best omitted from formal proceedings at present time. Before we walk into the day, they finally brought law, medicine, and church together under one roof to judge an 8-year-old girl. Let me turn to you for a moment. If someone in your town told you a child could speak the past you'd buried, would you listen? Or call it a trick to keep the peace? Drop a comment if you wish. Curse, illness, or something the powerful simply can't afford to name. Because on Seven Oaks, they chose not to name it. Instead, one more letter went out from New Orleans, promising a visit from a physician known for writing about the Negro brain. He ended with a tidy line. "If your case is as singular as reported, I would consider it an honor to witness a private demonstration." And so a day began to take shape when doctors, priest, and judge would gather in the Beauregard parlor, convinced they could classify what they feared. What happened there never reached their official reports. The morning they gathered her in the big house, the air felt wrong even before the bell rang. The sky hung low and colorless over the cane. The river moved like lead. In the front room, the shutters were half closed against the glare, turning the parlor into a kind of stage. Dr. Whitfield returned, this time with company. Beside him stood a taller man with a clipped beard and a hint of Paris in his clothes, Dr. Henri Duval of Charity Hospital. Father O'Reilly sat stiff in a carved chair, fingers resting on his crucifix. Judge Pritchard occupied a corner, coat unbuttoned, eyes taking in every detail. Thomas Beauregard hovered near the mantel, trying to look like a man calmly managing an oddity, not someone inviting strangers to examine his own fear. Lila was brought in from the shed, thinner than when Whitfield had first seen her. The room smelled of polish, cigar smoke, and something underneath, nervous sweat. Duval studied her like a specimen, not a child. He checked her eyes, her tongue, the angle of her skull, muttering a few words in French as he wrote in his notebook. "We shall proceed in stages," he announced. "Simple contacts. No leading questions." A housemaid was called first. She sat, hands trembling, while Lila's fingers closed around her wrist. The girl's eyes went distant. "You still hear him fall," she said softly. "Off the ship. You didn't jump in 'cause the man with the rope would have killed you too." The maid sobbed. No one in that room had known she once watched a brother drown. Next came a field hand, then a cousin of Mrs. Beauregard visiting from upriver. Each time, when skin met skin, some private scene spilled out. An oath broken, a hidden child, A drunk night that ended with someone pushed into a ditch and left. Whitfield kept his pen moving, but his stomach clenched. Duval's neat script grew jagged. Extraordinary capacity for recall, he whispered, as if the page might correct him. Thomas, flushing under each revelation, forced a smile. "Parlor tricks," he said thinly. No one answered. It was Pritchard who changed the course of the day. "You test her like she were sniffing out one life at a time," he drawled. "What happens if you give her more?" They arranged themselves around the center table. Thomas, Mrs. Beauregard, Caroline Marsh, Collins, Judge Pritchard, Father O'Reilly, Whitfield, Duval, Aunt May, Jacob, 2 chosen slaves for comparison. Lila was placed at the head of the table, barely able to see over it. "Everyone touch the wood," Duval said. "Let the child place her hand among ours." Fingers spread across the polished surface, brown and white, calloused and soft. Lila laid her palm down. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then her shoulders stiffened. The words came in gusts, not aimed, but pouring. "She pushed you," Lila said, eyes fixed on Caroline. Her voice shifted higher, frightened. "You watch her die, and you swallow it down." Caroline's lips parted soundlessly. "You sold her," the girl went on, turning toward Pritchard without moving her head. Her tone grew flat, older. "You lay with that child, and then you signed the paper that sent her away, so your name stayed clean." Pritchard's hand jerked off the table as if it were hot. "To your door they came," she told Father O'Reilly, voice laced with shame that wasn't hers. "You turned him off. Said it wasn't your business who bled in the street." The priest's fingers dug into his crucifix. She swung through them like that, not choosing, dragging up buried scenes with terrifying precision. For a moment, the room was nothing but breathing and the litany of their own acts, coming back to them in a child's mouth. Then her gaze unfocused entirely. "Smoke over water," she whispered. "Fields black, not green. Men in coats I don't know. Gray. Blue. Flags you ain't raised yet." Whitfield felt the hairs rise on his neck. Duval frowned. "What is this?" he demanded. "Papers say we free," Lila murmured, eyes showing nothing. Chains still sittin' in folks' heads. Men in robes, men in suits, different names, same fear. Her body began to shake. A thin line of blood slipped from one nostril. Mrs. Beauregard's vision narrowed. She clutched her chair, certain she was about to faint. Thomas's chest tightened, a phantom weight echoing some future pain. One of the lesser guests slid to the carpet in a dead faint, knocking a glass from the sideboard. "Enough!" Father O'Reilly shouted, beginning a prayer in Latin so loud it was almost a scream. Duval reached for Lila to check her pulse. Her hand twitched away. She drew one last breath that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond her lungs. "You can sell me," she said, each word clear. "You can beat me. You can kill me. But what you done already livin' in too many of us. You can't scrub it out." Then she collapsed, limp, eyes rolled back. For a long moment, no one moved. Then everyone did at once, voices rising, orders colliding. Water was called for, smelling salts, a pillow, a priest. Later, they would argue about what exactly had been said. Some would call it a fit, others hysteria. But in that first raw silence, every person in the room knew the same thing. What they had witnessed could not be neatly filed under trick or disease without lying to themselves. Duval's early notes on collective anamnesis in colored subject filled half a page before Pritchard's hand closed over his pen. "Doctor," the judge said softly, "for your sake and ours, I suggest this particular case never finds its way into any official minutes." By nightfall, torn scraps of Duval's report curled in the parlor fire. Whitfield watched the paper blacken and fold, knowing very well that burning ink and ash would not erase what had settled in his own memory. Not every trace died in that grate. A few lines, scattered in other hands and other books, would slip past the flames and wait quietly for someone willing to piece them back together. When dawn came the next day, the Beauregard house was hushed like a church after a storm. The shutters still rattled faintly in the wind, and the smell of ash from the fireplace hung in every corner. Lila lay in the narrow bed of a storage room, her pulse thin but steady. Someone, likely Mrs. Beauregard, had wiped the blood from her face and wrapped her in a clean sheet. The men had argued deep into the night. Duval wanted her moved to Charity Hospital for study. Pritchard urged commitment to a parish asylum where no further scandal could spread. Father O'Reilly demanded an exorcism. Thomas Beauregard, pale and silent, only said, "She's my property, and she stays where I say." It wasn't compassion, only fear of losing control of the story. By noon, Collins had packed his bags and ridden off upriver, claiming urgent business. He did not look back. In town, he would later tell a tavern crowd that the girl had died, that her witch tongue choked her in the end. The lie caught quickly. Back on the plantation, silence thickened. The enslaved spoke of Lila in whispers, unsure if she breathed or not. Jacob slipped into the storeroom after dark and found her awake, eyes open but distant. "They burnin' everything you said," he murmured. "I see it," she answered faintly. "Paper turnin' black." He pressed a small bundle into her hands. Cornbread, a rag doll, a scrap of cloth torn from Aunt May's apron. "If a chance come, you run. Don't you look back." But there was no chance, not yet. Her strength returned slowly, though she no longer looked at anyone for long. The visions had changed. Now they came without touch, flickers of futures she didn't understand. A boy in a blue coat, shouting across smoke. A woman standing before a crowd reading from a paper, her hands shaking but free. Weeks later, word spread of fighting in Kansas, men killing over whether new land would hold chains or not. The planters muttered, uneasy. "It's only politics," Thomas said at supper. But his hand trembled when he reached for his glass. Dr. Whitfield, back in New Orleans, tried to settle his mind through routine. He lectured at the hospital, performed examinations, dined with colleagues who laughed about mesmerists and spiritual fads. Yet at night he dreamed of a girl's voice speaking through him in words he didn't write. Once, waking from such a dream, he found he had scrawled across his notes, "We remember what we are not supposed to." He sealed the notebook and hid it behind the plaster of his study wall. At Seven Oaks, Lila began to wander at night. The first time, Aunt May found her barefoot in the yard, staring toward the river. "They comin' soon," she whispered. "Men in coats, noise like thunder that don't stop." After that, she was locked inside. But the words she'd spoken, "they comin'," traveled faster than chains. Slaves on nearby plantations repeated them as warning or hope, depending on how they felt about deliverance. The overseers called it rumor. Nigger talk. That winter, Mrs. Beauregard fell ill. Fever burned through her in waves, and the house became a place of damp cloths and whispered prayers. On the third night, when no tonic eased her pain, she asked for the girl. Thomas refused, but his wife's voice cracked. "Let her come, please." Lila was brought to the bedside, guarded by two housemaids. The mistress's face was gray, her lips trembling. "If you can, see," she whispered. "Tell me what waits on the other side." Lila hesitated, then took her hand. Her voice softened until it was barely more than breath. "There's light," she said, "and sound like water. But it don't wash clean what you done. You got to walk through it first. Tears slipped from the dying woman's eyes. Does he forgive? Lila's gaze unfocused. He remember, she answered. That's worse, maybe. But maybe that's love, too. The mistress died before morning. In her Bible, later, someone found a note. The child is not of the devil. She is what he leaves behind when we forget. Her death loosened the last order that had held the plantation still. Thomas began to drink heavily, muttering about debts, about Yankees, about omens in human skin. Aunt May kept Lila close, but even she could feel something shifting underfoot, the slow crack in the world before it breaks. One evening, standing by the window of the quarters, Lila told her quietly, "They think they can hide what they done to us, but the ground don't forget. One day, it gon' talk too." The river carried those words away, down toward New Orleans, past the places where doctors burned notes and judges sealed records. It carried them into the same current that would one day deliver soldiers and papers and the new names for old wounds. For now, though, on 7 Oaks, the story lay buried under winter mud, waiting, restless, almost awake. Decades passed before anyone dared speak her name again. The war came and went, leaving the Beauregard estate a shell, cane fields overgrown, chimneys black against the sky. 7 Oaks crumbled, its ledgers damp and eaten by insects. But the name, Lila, lingered like smoke in the mouths of those who remembered too much. By the 1930s, the world had turned another face. Old folks sat on porches in St. Charles Parish, their hands like maps of years no one asked about. That summer, a young woman from the Federal Writers Project arrived with a notebook and a government badge, collecting what the program called slave narratives. They sent her to a woman everyone called Aunt May. 90, maybe more. No one knew for sure. Her sight was thin, her breath uneven, but her memory sharp as glass. The interviewer asked about the old days, about masters and crops, about freedom. Then she asked if there were any strange stories from the quarters. Aunt May looked past her, as if she saw a child standing behind the girl with the pencil. "There was one," she said. "A baby that come quiet, didn't cry, just looked at me and told me what I'd done wrong." The young woman blinked. "You mean she talked?" "Not like you talk," Aunt May said. "She talked through your own head. I tried to send that baby back to the Lord, but the Lord sent her back to us. Carried white folks' sins in her little head." The interviewer wrote quickly, the words awkward on the page. Later, the transcript filed in Baton Rouge labeled it, "Curious Superstition." But Aunt May's tone, caught faintly in the recording, wasn't superstition. It was fatigue, the sound of someone who had carried truth too long in silence. Years later, in the archives of the Freedmen's Bureau, a different researcher found a short note from 1867. Colored female, approx. Age 20, mental affliction. Says she sees papers of white folks in her head. The initial L stood alone in the margin. And then came the discovery of Mrs. Emily Beauregard Marsh's diary, unearthed in the attic of a New Orleans townhouse. The pages smelled of mildew and guilt. One entry read, "When I was a child, there was a little colored girl who frightened Mama. She knew things Mama prayed about. Papa called her a curse. I think she was a mirror. A graduate student at Tulane, working on a paper titled Folklore of St. Charles Parish, connected the dots. The child in the diary, the woman in the bureau record, the testimony of Aunt May. The names and dates matched too precisely to dismiss. Even Dr. Whitfield's notebook surfaced, decades after his death, in a box of family papers donated to a medical library. Most pages were routine, cases of fever, gangrene, childbirth complications. But between them sat an entry numbered Case 7. Beneath it, in faint ink, colored girl, impossible anamnesis. The next pages had been torn out clean. On the following sheet, written in the margin, "Better not present to society." That small note, half caution, half confession, told more than the missing pages could. In 1964, a young black historian from Xavier University read those words and wrote in her own journal. They buried her twice. Once in the ground, once in the record. We are the ones digging her up again. The fragments kept surfacing. A parish record marked "unfit for labor." A letter from Judge Pritchard's estate, warning his heirs to avoid all mention of the Seven Oaks incident. A yellowing photograph labeled only Aunt May, St. Charles Parish, 1937. Piece by piece, the story rebuilt itself, not whole, but alive enough to breathe. And now, as you listen, know that every line of this tale came from hands that refused to let it die. From an old woman's trembling memory. From a torn medical note no one was meant to read. From the whisper between generations that says, "The past isn't gone. It's only waiting to be heard." If you're still here, listening, tell me, in your own family, what stories were whispered and never written down. What truths lived in the kitchen, not the courthouse. Because these voices, fragile as paper, survive only when someone answers back. Picture a desk lit by a single lamp in a quiet room, not on a plantation, but in a modern archive. Boxes of brittle paper, a laptop humming softly, a pair of tired eyes following the same name across a century. That's where we'll end. Not in the cane, but in the records that tried to forget the cane existed. The person at that desk could be a professor from Howard, a grad student from Xavier, or just someone like you who went looking for family and found a stranger instead. On the screen, digitized pages from the Freedmen's Bureau, WPA interviews, church logs. On the table, a photocopy of Dr. Whitfield's notebook, a transcript of Aunt May, a scan of Emily Beauregard Marsh's diary. Separate, they're just fragments. Together, they spell the outline of a girl whose life was never meant to be seen whole. Alongside those papers sits another file, thinner but stubborn. Clippings and oral histories about a black nurse who worked in a New Orleans hospice in the 1980s. Patients near the end swore she knew about brothers who drowned, children given away, things they had never confessed. Her nieces remember family talk about a great-grandmama from up the river who saw into folks. The trail of names and marriages leads back toward St. Charles Parish, then blurs into smudged ink and missing pages. Is she Lila's blood? The documents don't say. The census lists are inconsistent. The surnames change with each generation. There is, in one family Bible, a name squeezed into the margin. Lila. Lost but not forgotten. For a historian, that's not proof. For a family, it's enough to tell stories by. So maybe the gift traveled down a line of daughters. Or maybe what Lila carried was never about a power in the blood, but about what happens when people refuse to let other folks own their past. Call it second sight, call it trauma, call it history pushing back through time. The effect is the same. Things hidden in one century find a voice in another. That same researcher, turning Whitfield's notebook in gloved hands, once noticed a faint scrawl on the blank back of a page. Not the doctor's neat script, a rougher, younger hand in dull pencil. They scared to write you down. No date, no signature. It could have been a child in the Whitfield family playing with an old book. It could have been written decades later by someone who didn't even know who you was. Or, and here, the line between reason and imagination wavers. It could be exactly what it looks like. A message that finally slipped through. The woman who found it said, half under her breath, "Lila, is that you talking across years?" No thunder answered, just the soft buzz of the lights and the crinkle of old paper. but she kept the copy. And that's why the sentence reached you. So where does that leave us? With a child on a plantation who made doctors, priests, and judges fear their own memories. With an old woman on a porch who refused to let that child vanish. With you, listening, deciding whether this is superstition, miracle, or simply the truth about how long harm hangs on. If in your family there were stories told only at night, or names spoken softly because that's not for outsiders, maybe tonight is the night you write them down. A comment under a video isn't an official archive, but sometimes it's the only one our people ever get. Lila's story is just one thread in a cloth too wide to see from here. And if one girl in Louisiana could shake the men who thought they owned history, imagine how many other voices are still knocking on the walls of our memory. Next time, we'll walk with a boy from Georgia who woke up with welts on his back that no one could see. Marks from a life he swore he'd already lived.